Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lempe, your regular host. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about advice, both how to receive feedback and get good feedback and honest feedback from people, but then framing it into advice for commanders to act on it or make better decisions. My guest today is the Senior Enlisted Advisor to the CDF, or SEAC, Warrant Officer Ken Robertson. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sue. As a Air Force warrant officer, it's not lost on me being on an Army podcast, and I'm honoured to be here. Thank you.
I suppose that's what we asked you to be on, because we want to sort of talk about your current role, and you've been in the job for now 18 months ish as the Senior Enlisted Advisor to the CDF. Can you just go through, before we get to advice, and how sort of what you went through growing up as an aviator throughout your career, and then now to reach the height of SEAC? Can you just go through what your current role is and what it was designed for?
Yeah, absolutely, Sue. So the genesis of the position starts about 3 years ago with previous CDF General Campbell. Of note, we're the last Five Eyes country to have a SEAC position. And so General Campbell, observed that at every level of command in this organisation, there's usually a senior NCO or a warrant officer giving that sage advice and counsel to command. So think of section level to battalion level to brigade and then division. There's a senior enlisted leader or advisor giving that sage advice and counsel, except at every level except for his. And he came to the conclusion that as we move to be more integrated post DSR and National Defence Strategy in particular, he needed a warrant officer to be able to collate those workforce issue concerns, work collectively with the service warrant officers and regimental sergeant major of the Army, not to be above them in rank, not to be below them, but to work collectively with them to collate all those workforce issue concerns and then go into the office of CDF and represent the enlisted workforce in the highest office that we have within the Australian Defence Force. So it's been a journey. My journey started in the mid-90s, joining from Western Australia. My first few years in the ADF was, to be honest, I harboured no other ambition than just to do my time and then go home. When I first joined in the mid-90s, we were rather a more, this is before Timor, before Iraq and Afghanistan. We're very non-operational unless, in some bespoke parts of the world. Mostly we were a training organisation, and it wasn't the Air Force that I'd been sold at recruiting, I don't think. I still loved it, but there was still that pull to go home. And but as we got through the years, I realised that I wasn't fulfilling my potential at all. I had some really strong mentors and senior NCOs that let me know that in no uncertain terms, both good and bad. And so it was my journey really started in leadership from about 2001 onwards, and I was just very fortunate to have some guidance along the way and really work through the ranks to warrant officer disciplinary or regimental sergeant major equivalent in the Air Force, and then from there into executive warrant officer appointment. So all of a sudden in a blink of an eye, sir, 30 odd years later, I'm sitting here.
Now the SEAC, yeah.
Yeah.
So I suppose that's an interesting point. Have you done any Army courses along the way, combined, I suppose? You talked about warrant officer discipline being the equivalent to RSMs in Army. Yeah. Have you done any courses?
Prior, in 2016, I was selected to be by Air Force to be the next Command Warrant Officer of Joint Task Force 633. And at that stage,
it's the Middle East, isn't it? Headquarters, yeah.
Middle East area of operations or Middle East region. And my principal was then going to be a Major General J.J. Fruin, and an infantry general and just an absolute gentleman, but a senior Army officer. So slightly daunting for me to be selected for that role. But then how do I impress upon him that I know what I'm talking about? So I volunteered to be a student on the Regimental Sergeant Major course. And I attended that course. I got a not yet competent only because I had to leave slightly early to go to force prep training, and I keep
to deploy.
To deploy, yeah. And I keep getting reminded that by some of my colleagues along the way on that course who are now Tier Bravo, Tier Charlie warrant officers, and But yeah, I have been offered to go back and do I think it's the drill and ceremonial component.
Finish off the last module.
To finish off, but
Yeah.
right now I've got a bit on my plate, but I might consider it moving forward.
Yes.
But that RSM course in particular was fantastic, just to get a view of what a regimental sergeant major does. Not too indifferent to what I did as a warrant officer disciplinary, but more so developing those networks and relationships across the Army, which then helped me to ply my trade as CWO 633, and it certainly helped with some credibility with my 2-star that I was going over with. So yeah, it was good.
That's right. Yeah. So you talked about, I won't go straight into this now, but you talked about 2001 being a sort of turning point for leadership. So let's go back to you as an aviator. Before we get to you getting feedback from aviators, now soldiers and sailors, can we go back and what was your journey going up with that switch to taking leadership a little bit more seriously, or having tough decisions and getting feedback yourself on your own performance throughout? Yeah.
The pivotal moment for me was in 1999 it was, actually, going that far back. I applied one of my NCOs, said, I think you'd make they were going through a review of all our positions in Air Force, and they were moving on Defence Corporate Review, I think it was, or Defence Corporate Support Review. Forgive me if I've got the terminology wrong, but basically they were getting rid of administrative and clerical positions, and so harvesting them for other more important areas in the Air Force. But regardless, my NCOs said, you make a really good recruit instructor. We'll send you over to do General Service Instructor selection. And so I went, okay, no worries. So I got myself all prepared for that. They ended up employing me as a weapon instructor over at Point Cook for a 12-month period, which was excellent. Getting myself into the space where I could do well on this course. And then I went and did this course, and my ego certainly got ahead of, I think, my abilities. And I got hey, don't come Monday. Thank you for turning up. We don't think you'd be a very good instructor, and on your way. And the drive from Adelaide back to Melbourne is a long and straight one, sir. And I think in that period of time, I said, I'm wasting my talent for leadership, which was far more advanced than what it was at the time. But coming back to Melbourne, that was, I think, the litmus test. That was the test of, well, I've come to a fork in the road moment. I can either go one way where I say, oh, thanks Air Force, and finish off my time and go home, or I can actually, work towards being a better leader. And I think it was then the feedback I got was rather frank and straight, but I was lucky enough to have NCOs and leaders in Melbourne in particular that said, put their arm around me and, figuratively speaking, and saying, hey, we've got you, we can make you better, you're just going to have to be humble, and you're going to have to take on this feedback about where you can get better.
I'm going to ask if that's the first time you've received that sort of feedback. But prior to that, I know I've listened to some of your stuff that you've recorded in amazing podcasts. I'll put them in the show notes as well. But on the basis of competitive footballer, that you went into basketball, been playing really good sport and being incredibly competitive. I suppose coming from that competitive nature in football and basketball and sporting field to come to that first realisation where they're like, don't come back. Was that the first time you're like, oh?
Maybe the first time that I'd failed myself, I think. And the sporting side of things was, I was still in my mid-20s, so I was still athletically, my body was still good enough to do what I wanted it to do. I was still playing a pretty highly competitive level of Australian rules and basketball, both in and out of defence. And so I hadn't really failed what I'd achieved in the sporting arena. So if anything, my competitiveness was getting to a stage as I got older from there, that when my body was starting to let me down, I could still thinking I could do what I used to do. And then my competitiveness, because I think people put up with that when you're producing, both on and off the field. They might put up with it back then anyway.
As in he's cocky, but he's matching it with performance.
100%. Yeah. And I was producing an end result. Either we were winning or I was adding to a team outcome, and they're willing to look past that white line fever, that competitiveness. But as you get older and as you become less reliable in that sense, the less people are willing to put up with it. And I had some really fortunate enough to have some really good mentors and friends who are friends to this very day, warrant officers and officers, just pull me aside and say, hey, look, I don't know who this person is that you're portraying, and I don't know this front that you're putting up, but it's affecting not only the ability to be able to get along with your teammates both on the field but also off it. And to have that feedback put to me from some of my closest colleagues and friends who usually put flowers on stuff, right? So for the most part, if you look around, your good friends, they'll add a little bit of gravy on it, and they'll make it not as bad as what it is. But to have some of my real friends, really close friends, sit me down and say, this might be hard to hear, but your competitiveness, both on the sporting field as well as off it, is getting in the way of you being the leader that we think you can be.
And how, I suppose you talked about how much you're putting like flowers on things or romanticising things as friends. How difficult was it to go and be like, so initially not just willing to reach out and accept feedback from other people that you respect or I suppose not, you don't get along with really well, but in that initial sense, how difficult was it to take that negative feedback from your friends?
Absolutely hard. Like it's tough because it's heartfelt from them. If they've, and in the fullness of time, maturity, and 30 odd years later, you look back and you go, geez, it must have been hard for them to do that, because for the most part, you don't want to ruin friendships, and potentially that might be the risk if you don't accept it for what it is. But I think that was just that moment of clarity for me when I went, geez, these are people who I really trust and respect the most in my life, telling me that, how I'm going about doing business, both from leadership during, with work and as well as on the sporting field. It just wasn't doing me any good. Frankly, I think now, as 30 years later, I not only seek out that advice from friends, but the best piece of advice I have when you're seeking return on what your performance is perceived as is go speak and go seek feedback from those that you normally wouldn't have a beer with, or go speak to people in your unit, or peers of your own rank level that you wouldn't normally seek advice from. Go seek advice from them. So, hey, how do you perceive me as an operator? How do you perceive me going about my daily business, both in and outside of work? And if you're not ready for the advice that you're going to receive, I'd probably suggest you don't ask the question in the first place. But go in there, drop the ego and say, right, whatever, it might hurt, but the best piece of advice I've had in years past is that if it hurts a little, the feedback that you get, there's probably a fair element of truth to it.
Because we try to avoid that negative or the hurt, I suppose, to use your analogy. But and we try to surround people like that. We naturally hang out with people that are like ourselves.
Like-minded,
So as you raise up the ranks and you shift tack to sort of this different focus, as you get further up in the ranks, you start to get less and less peers, I suppose.
That's right.
So does it become more important or less important? And how do you go about it as you got to a warrant officer, so flight sergeant and warrant officer, and then subsequently now like SEAC, like the top enlisted? How did you go about shifting focus to get negative feedback when you start to get higher and higher and there's fewer people to give you that feedback?
Just taking a little step back there, slightly compromising and even making it even more challenging for me is that when I remustered to warrant officer disciplinary, I'd been identified for promotion to flight sergeant, but I actually didn't wear the rank. I just went straight from sergeant to Y1, which I could,
daunting.
Which is unthinkable in an army sense, but back then for us was just normal practice for you to remuster to warrant officer disciplinary. So that was a challenge. Also, there was a rank level there that I'd skipped where I just didn't have the ability, because every rank level that you go through, clearly in defence, you make mistakes, you learn from them, and you hopefully in the fullness of time you learn from them, you don't do them again. So that for me, I think, to answer your question, is I just had to learn to be humble and to really realise that I could, I'm now a warrant officer or a Y1 equivalent. I don't know everything. In actual fact, I was thinking, geez, it was rather daunting. So to be humble enough to go every day that I'm going to incrementally learn, but I'm going to seek out advice from senior officers. I'm going to seek out advice from other warrant officers, but more importantly, I'm going to seek out advice from senior NCOs. And look, for the most part, creating an environment and an environment, a psychological safe place, I call it. And that's not to be, to lessen the military environment. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be a military environment, but to create a psychological safe place that your senior NCOs, especially, and your fellow warrant officers can come to you and say, I don't think you're doing the right thing. Or, sir, do you have a moment? And then accepting that, regardless of whether you believe what is being said to you, that is their perception, and that you've created that trust environment, and you've created that culture that they can come and tell you that. Now, I'm not saying that you should just readily accept it and not have a viewpoint in return, but to thank them for that and say, look, I appreciate what you're saying to me. I do counter by saying this, or maybe take a couple of hours to have a think about it.
Yeah, I think that's important too, because you can get on the defensive straight away.
Yeah. 100%. And because that's a natural human reaction.
Put up the walls, yeah.
Yeah, and think about it, right? We're in a military environment where we are taught, drilled into us is excellence, right? And I think excellence also comes with humility, in that even the most, the best leaders in the world that I see today are the most humble, are the ones that have learnt lessons along the way, but also accept feedback in any form. And sure, some of it might hurt, but it make you a better leader, and some of it you might just throw over your shoulder and say, look, thank you, I appreciate it, but then move on. But if you've created that environment for people to give you feedback at all levels, and you can't accept it, well then watch them not come to you.
And watch poorer outcomes, I suppose, as a result of not getting that feedback.
Well, you'll sit in your ivory tower, you'll sit in your office thinking everything's fine when there's a there's a dumpster fire out in your workplace. And look, for the most part, being that, especially as a senior enlisted leader or as a senior NCO, you're that conduit between command and your enlisted, and your junior enlisted in particular, is that if they're not coming to you, well, you've failed in leadership. I think Colin Powell has a famous saying in that regard. As soon as your soldiers stop coming to you with problems, well, then you failed in leadership. That's leadership 101. Mm-hmm. And so if you can sit in your ivory little office, or you're part of the battalion or your unit or your squadron or your ship, and thinking everything's fine when clearly it's not. And then they'll work around you. Mm-hmm. And if anything, that's the biggest test. When I walk into a unit, a squadron, a ship, or a battalion, when I'm speaking with the troops or I'm speaking with the senior enlisted, I'm looking to see how they interact. I'm looking to see how they communicate with not only myself but the senior enlisted, and whether that senior enlisted or that RSM or that CSM has created an environment where they know who the boss is, but they feel comfortable enough to bring their problems and as well as solutions to them. I think dropping the ego is probably the most important part of being humble in that regard.
Yeah, that's my next point as well, is talking about that, in sort of setting that environment as you move around. You've got a mountainous task. I don't know why, but I imagine you flying all around Australia and then just like on one time being ship with you're on a ship with here in Pro on the bridge wing firing a 50 cal and then going to a flying squadron and getting around a flying squadron up at Amberley, and then subsequently getting into the battalions and trying to get create that environment where you can get like reliable feedback and accurate feedback. How do you go about getting advice from thousands now of sailors, soldiers and aviators? And then, how do you go about getting that feedback?
Well, first and foremost, I give my flowers. I give the flowers to service warrant officers and regimental sergeant major of the Army whenever I can, because I'm only as effective as my relationship with them. And since day one, you can imagine a new position's created. They've had the service warrant officer RSMA cohort for many, many years and decades even. And all of a sudden there's this new position created, which is works directly for CDF and has a left and right of arc of remit, which is rather broad. Those service warrant officers and RSMA have said, hey, look, you go out to the workforce, you go out to the bases, to ships, battalions, and when you speak with those sailor soldiers and aviators, you get a different perspective.
Yeah.
You might get a different view, and just feed that back into us. And they've been brilliant, and the current cohort in particular, I'm just very thankful for. But to answer your question, sir, when I go out, and you just can't possibly be in all places at once. But it's building the trust with the workforce, and that there'll be places I go. It's fascinating. I'll go visit a base, and clearly the spin up in regards to SEAC's the Senior Enlisted Advisor, the CDF's turning up. Why? Why is he turning up? Why is he there? Well, I'm just turning up to see how you're doing. Like, how's your preparedness activities going? How are you doing operationally? What are some of your issues or concerns? And I'll always have an in-brief going into a unit, and I'll always go have an out-brief with the CO and the RSM and say, hey, I'm not here to work against the chain of command. I'm actually here to see how I can support you. And I always have a question of the workforce. If you had 2 minutes with CDF, what would you say? What would you bring up with him? And it helps to shape my conversations with the CDF. And I suppose my last point in that regard too is that quite clearly I can't be in all places at once, but what I will do is hopefully set a culture and environment where, if I'm at a town hall or I'm on a ship or in a battalion somewhere, I say, hey, look, if you don't remember anything of my visit with you today or my engagement with you, as long as when I leave that you know that there is a warrant officer speaking on your behalf and representing and advocating on your behalf into the office of our highest ranked officer in this organisation, I'm good with that. And then building on that subsequent visits. And it takes time. Like when I first came into the job, I was probably in it for about a month, and I walk outside of R1 and this leading aircraftsman comes up to me and says, "Oh, g'day sir, how you going? I remember you at your time at Air Command. I didn't know we had a new warrant officer of the Air Force." And I went, "Yeah, we don't." Yeah. And so clearly, when you're establishing a position, you've just got to get out from behind your desk. I'm very fortunate that both CDFs have really empowered me to go visit. Same with the service chiefs and the service woes and RSMA, and so get out there and visit, and get out and get your voice heard, and that's important. And I think that's the thing, just being consistent and being consistent in your presence, consistent in your visit schedule. Like for example, heading up to Townsville and Rocky and whatnot with TS, and in the next 12 months I want to get up there again and say right, and potentially either alongside CDF or just by myself, regardless, building that trust with the workforce. That's probably the key, and the consistency of it. I mean, you turn up, once in a tenure, you're going to have problems building trust with your workforce. So that's my advice in that regard.
And like obviously you wear a blue uniform, so I'm going to make the assumption that when you go to RAF units, that they're the most warm welcoming. Is that true, or do you reckon? Like, not to say you don't have to say Army just because it's on the podcast, but what is the reception like at different? Is it like quite comfortable for you to go to RAF units, and then, or is it just an awesome experience every time because you get to see soldiers and sailors and aviators doing awesome things?
With my previous appointments as COA 633, and then I was at Warrant Officer Joint Operations, I'm very comfortable in the joint environment. So for the most part, you have to know your stuff. Like if I'm visiting an Army base, I will reach in to the chain of command, I'll read my travel packs, I'll reach in to the senior enlisted leaders and command, say, hey, what are some of the issues? Like, it was probably daunting when I was COA 633, because that was the first real deep immersion into the joint environment. Now I'm very comfortable, regardless of whether it's Air Force, Navy, or Army. I'm very comfortable, only because I think that with the time that I've spent in the joint force, that I'm across the issues and concerns. Not that I'm a master of them or an SME in them, but for the most part, I can speak confidently on those issues and concerns, and equally, those joint billets and joint appointments that I've had previously have enabled me to develop a network of senior enlisted and commanders across the three services for the most part. So there's not many there's not many bases that I'll visit, especially with that I don't know anyone. Yeah. So there's always someone that say, hey, g'day, how you going? It's good to see you again. And once again, building that familiarity, building that trust with the workforce. If anything, the best piece of advice I'll give to people is that your reputation will precede you. How you interact with people, how you engage with people, how, one of the best piece of advice I got is that your worst day in defence, someone will remember. And so, your interactions with everyone from the time that you're a corporal right through to the time that you're a SEAC or a service warrant officer, people will still remember how you treated them when you were
decades ago.
100%. Even my engagement online and social media, I still have a chuckle now and then. I remember when he was my warrant officer disciplinary at one recruit training unit. I'm just going, oh, geez.
Decades ago.
Decade, you know, a couple of decades now. So these are things that, you know, that your reputation will precede you. And so how you go about doing that and building your reputation and trust with people is just as important. So, yeah, that's my best piece of advice in that regard. So.
Yeah. If we go back to that feedback you get from soldiers, sailors and aviators, in terms of you posed that question, you know, if you had 2 minutes with the CDF, what would you say? How are you going in and sort of, I don't want to say truth sourcing because it seems too black and white, but how do you talked about the, you didn't use the term vibe, but I will, inside the unit and the command culture, I suppose. How do you go about making sure that the feedback that you're getting is truthful and like enough, you know, everything that they've got type thing? Is it weird walking into a room and sort of holding back or doing different things?
No, it's a great question, Sue. And I think more to the point, whenever I engage in a town hall or you know, even just a small group, I said, if you ask me a question, I'll write it down and I'll get you an answer. But I will caveat by this. It may not be the answer you like or want, but I assure you I'll get you an answer. And for the most part, if someone asks me a question, I'll write it down, or if I don't write it down, my trusty EA will. If I chase it up, I'm going to chase it up through the chain of command and I'll seek truth through that before I get an answer back to you. So my expectation is with the workforce is that they've gone through the chain of command, that the question they're asking me is clearly truthful in nature, and yeah, sure, there might be some exaggeration to it as sometimes there is, but for the most part, my expectation is that before I walk into the office of CDF, I'm gonna ground truth it first and foremost. And more importantly, I'm going to try and get some data to it so I can, you know, create an answer and then, or at least set up a solution for it so I can go into boss and say, hey, boss, here's a problem set from the workforce. I've got a couple of solutions and here you go. So I think if anything, sir, my advice for leaders is and NCOs in particular is when they're advocating into command or senior enlisted leaders are advocating to commanders is that do your groundwork. And truth serum, I suppose, is the point I'll make there. Is that, you know, don't take everything that comes into your office as being gospel as much as, you know. I'm not accusing or calling the workforce liars in any way, shape, or form, but there may be some person's truth. There might be something else to it that you can actually add to be able to, you know, provide more facts to it. So, yeah, I'm always reticent to take something straight away and then go straight into the boss. That would be remiss of me doing that.
Yeah.
I'll always take it and say, hey, let me do some ground truth. Let me get some information back to you. And sometimes the information I get back and say, hey, thank you for that question. Thank you for your viewpoint. I found that there's actually it's different because of this, or I'll provide you I'll offer you this advice moving forward that is not entirely what you've reflected to me. And for the most part, I'll never put it to the workforce and say, hey, look, you know, what you're telling me is wrong. It's just that perception's reality, right? And so always ground truth. I'll always go away and source. I'm very fortunate to have access into all parts of this organisation, especially into the military personnel organisation in particular when it comes to policy and procedure, especially when it comes to conditions of service and salary and whatnot. So, yeah, ground truthing that and then getting back and saying, all right, no, I agree with you, and I'm going to take that forward with the support of the chain of command into the office of CDF or feed that back into the service warrant officers and RSMA.
Yeah, that's absolutely. Is there, when you walk into a room of people, I imagine it's always large, most of the time large groups and mixed ranks and all that sort of stuff. Do you ever get is there any signs of do you get nervous about certain things? Like, is there an element of silence for a moment while they won't approach you with questions, or do you find that most of the questions are asked in the group or afterwards when they come up and they're like, hey, sir, do you remember me from 20 years ago when you were my warrant officer discipline and one RTU? What's the mix of questions from the group and individual, but also is there anything that makes you nervous? Large silence, scripted questions? I take it you're not a massive scripted questions type guy. You like the honest approach. So is there anything that makes you nervous? Yeah,
the scripted questions I've never agreed with because it's always, I don't know, it's not real for me. It's, you know, I actually encourage. I say to I used to say to my troops when I was a unit warrant officer, I'd say, hey, you know, let your conscience be your guide, which can be risky at times.
Yeah.
But for the most part,
That's what they told me with this podcast, to be honest. But yes,
yeah, exactly. But for the most part, I suppose silence is, going back to my point about if your soldiers, sailors, and aviators don't feel comfortable in bringing you their issues or concerns, well, then there's a problem straight away. For the most part, I'll always leave Q&A until the end, so I try and build a rapport with them during my engagement. And sure, like I've walked into plenty of forums where they're just looking at me going, "Who is this guy?" Army's the same. Like I usually try and wear my AMCUs when I visit an establishment.
Yeah, that's good.
So I don't stand out. Who's this guy wearing this blue GPUs? But for the most part, I'll go in there and I'll develop rapport over about a 20-minute period, 20 to 25 minutes, just giving them, this is my views, this is my expectations, eliciting responses, and then, feeding off the energy in the room, whether they're agreeing or not, that's fine. And then leaving Q&A to the end. And invariably there will always be one that'll ask a question, and then I'll go, great question.
Opens the floodgates, yeah.
Here's my answer.
Yeah.
But I'll always caveat by saying, hey, as I briefly mentioned before, so I'm employed to speak truth to power, but I'm also employed to speak truth to people. And please, if I have an answer, I'm going to give it to you. And I think for the most part, the workforce appreciates that. They appreciate the honesty and the upfront. They don't want political answers from senior enlisted. They just want the truth, and I'll soon tell people whether I'll advocate accordingly on their behalf, because it's not Ken Robertson's viewpoint of what the workforce thinks. It's the workforce viewpoint. It may not necessarily align with what I think, but I'll let them know that. But for the most part, and conditions of service is
it's always the easy question. Like they'll just be like, I'll pay something really specific and niche.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. Like for example, the most common one, sir, is as ADF members, we should be paying less tax. Now, I have a particular viewpoint there, is that as Australians, the benefit of the tax system, whether you agree with it or not, is that we all pay it. It's just the amounts we pay is depending on how much money we earn. But across Australian society, everyone pays tax. And, are we any different to, say, emergency services personnel that work every day saving lives? Are we any different to, and don't get me wrong, there's certain situations where ADF personnel will pay less tax on deployment and in certain situations, and I'm all for that. But to generically say across the board that we should be paying less tax just whilst we work our everyday role, I don't agree with. But it would have been remiss of me not to take that viewpoint from the workforce, put it up formally through the chain of command and say, hey, look, this is what the workforce is talking about. But I'll certainly let them know my viewpoints on it, because it'd be remiss of me not to. And I find that engagement's really good. Like they genuinely, because blind advocacy is not advocacy, sir. All right, when I'm going into the office of a service chief or the CDF or VCDF and I'm talking about a particular matter, blind advocacy won't get you anywhere. I should be able to have that discussion with the workforce and come to a certain viewpoint and say, right, okay, I'm happy to go forward with that, but just know that the likelihood of success is this, or that'll it's not going to be an easy fix, but I'll certainly do that. And that's one thing I think which I get really good feedback from the workforce on. And I'll also say, just because you don't see advocacy doesn't mean it's not necessarily occurring. All the discussions behind closed doors. Yeah,
you're closing that loop behind the closed doors after you've left and stuff, and then 100%. Re-engage to be like, this is what's happened so far, despite the fact that you might not have thought anything happened. These are all the steps we've been through. And,
absolutely. So, but plus you also, and I think you alluded to it in the question, is that in a public forum, you'll get people who are confident to ask a question, and they'll put their hand up and they'll ask it, and they're more than happy. They don't care whether it's controversial otherwise. But then you'll have people in the crowd that they've got a great question, but they don't feel comfortable in asking it. So my advice to senior leaders or senior enlisted also, so when they're talking those forums, say, hey, look, I'm going to hang around make time. I'm going to hang around for the next 10, 20 minutes. Those people who didn't feel comfortable asking a question in a public forum, or whether we ran out of time, come up, see me. My chief petty officer's staying here, writing down a whole bunch of, and talk to me, and let's see whether we can have a conversation. And I don't think I've been to any forum across the three services where I haven't had at least 3 or 4 sailor soldiers and aviators come up to me and after said, "Oh, look, sir, I'm not sure whether I wasn't entirely comfortable in asking a question in a public forum, but what do you think about this?" I said, "Yeah, that's a really good question. I would have loved for you to ask that, but thank you." And then you go down that rabbit hole. And equally, I've got a public email a group inbox. I say, you send me an email with a question about anything to do with the ADF or advocacy or whatnot, I promise you I will not forward that without your permission. And so if you've got a question...
That builds that trust.
100%.
Yeah.
And that's the foundation of it, is the trust with the workforce, is that you're not going to forward it and CC them and then flick it on to some senior officer who's going to look dimly on that young person. For the most part, that's where you're their voice as a senior enlisted leader, as an NCO. You're the voice of the workforce, but it's not blind advocacy. It's having a discussion with the workforce and actually educating themselves. What I've found, the biggest criticism I have, and I'm clearly a strong advocate for senior NCOs, but I suppose if I have a criticism of senior NCOs across the ADF is that if I was to say to work on one thing, it'd be to educate yourself on policies, procedures. There's reasons why things exist. And if you blindly advocate on behalf of your workforce and can't deliver, well, then you lose your credibility with that part of the workforce because you've just gone ahead and blindly advocated. For senior NCOs in particular, you'll have a digger or a sailor or a soldier, a sailor, aviator, should I say, come in and say, why is this occurring? Why are we paying more Mariquota rand, or why is this occurring? Well, oh yeah, that's ordinary. I agree. We're gonna, we have to fix that. I said, hey, look, on the face of it, yeah, it sounds concerning. Let me go let me find out, and I'll get back to you. For the most part, there's generally a good reason for things occurring. It's just fleshing that out and then going back and saying, hey, you know what, it's, I agree with you. It's not the most ideal situation, but here's the reason why. And your sailors, your soldiers and the aviators, they'll still have an inherent right to go away and moan about it. And as I did when I was
we all used our right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what we do as military. I'm not saying it's wrong, but but at least they can't say that they weren't well informed. And I think if NCOs and senior NCOs in particular did more that way, less concerns would end up in my inbox or be brought to my attention. For the most part, some of the easiest questions I get asked, some of the questions I get asked, some of the easiest to answer that I can either go to the internet and find or seek out through a public, information which is publicly available. That's where I think senior NCOs can be better, and warrant officers for that part.
And build that reliability from answering those questions straight away.
Credibility.
You get a question posed to you and you answer it straight away, keep up policy, and keep it.
Absolutely.
Your point about sticking around after a session where you ask questions is super interesting. I've seen recently at ADFA with the training officer body, we had Chief of Air Force and a Warrant Officer Air Force come, and they did a brief, and then afterwards change into PT gear, and they're doing PT with the year ones. Yeah. SOC and the CWO for Special Operations Command did the same thing. Yeah. It was absolutely awesome because they're running alongside training officers asking about, and they're like, we get this opportunity to provide feedback to the Chief of Air Force at PT. How good is this? Sticking around is so valuable. So if we talk about, so that's getting feedback, and you've talked about it a couple of times or hinted towards it, but changing that feedback into sort of advice. How do you go about so you're going through the process of receiving an issue, whatever that may be. Hopefully there's positive feedback as well, but it seems like it's all
sometimes.
But then you go through the point of truth checking it and going through the process of reaching into each organisation, because you must have an into a lot of different places. How do you go about, so for the warrant officers out there that are approaching, or new troop sergeants that are approaching giving command advice for the first time, how do you go about transitioning that from feedback to advice?
Timing and context would be my primary piece of advice there, sir. I had when I was at the unit level, I had a CO I worked for, and I set it up at the start of our command/leadership team tenure. I said, hey, look, sir, when I walk into your office and I close the door, I really need 2 minutes of your time. I promise I'll get to the point, but I really need that 2 minutes of your time. If I walk in your office, sir, and I don't close the door, please feel free to tell me to come back at some other time. But equally, what he said to me is he said, yep, absolutely, I'm happy to stick by that. But if you walk into my office and I clearly don't look like I'm in a state of mind to be able to sit down and receive feedback, please don't push the point and come back at some other time. Absolutely. And so there's that communication between advice to command and the actual command is that timing and context piece, and having the emotional intelligence to have an understanding about when a commander or whatever section to subunit command to command, having an understanding that it might not be the right time right now. And equally, don't give advice in front of others. That is something which will invariably, as a enlisted leader, come back and bite you. Is that giving advice to and rather robust advice to a commissioned officer in front of others may is compromising their command presence and their level of command. And so be mindful. You're going to give advice which you may think this might be rather controversial in nature, or it might be testing in nature. Do it behind closed doors. And so timing and context in particular in that regard, and also have a solution. So you're going to go to you're giving advice to command. More than likely, it's a problem, or it might be something that they've done, or there might be something that they're about to do, or said. Go in there with a solution in relation to either the problem that you're posing to the command or the advice you're going to give. So, ma'am, you said this. May I suggest that next time when you're speaking, you clarify this, and that, because then that will end this, or that will tie off this, instead of saying, "Hey, that didn't come across well, boss." Okay, why didn't that come across well? Give me that. Give me that feedback. And the really good officers I've worked for in my career to date, they're the ones that have turned around and said, "Hey, give it to me. Did that come across well? Did my presentation hit all the marks?" And be frank with me. But then offer a solution in regards to how I can do it better. And I think that's important too. So respectful communication also is that as warrant officers and as NCOs, we are primarily not decision makers. We are advisors, and with that advice to commissioned officers and to command, being respectful at all times is just as important. So respectful communication to timing and context, and then and clearly accuracy of that information and advice you're going to give.
Yeah, because you don't want to be caught out to be like, "Oh, that's not the case," and you're like, "Oh, I should have truth checked that a little bit further."
Yeah.
Making those small mistakes in the early days when you're just learning stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But if you do that on a regular basis, well, then your commander, whatever the level they're at, is in the back of their mind, they're going to go, "Am I going to find out in the future this is not entirely accurate again?" And so when your NCOs or your senior NCOs and warrant officers walk into command at any level, they should feel reassured that 99.99% of the time that's going to be accurate. And on another occasion it may not be. So that respectful communication and timing and context is important, as well as accuracy.
And I suppose from the other side, with the commander, being sort of somewhat busy, I think sometimes you will be in the height of business, but that doesn't mean that it's everything you're doing at the time is important. You've got an iPhone going off, a screen, and you can't concentrate. Your troop sergeant comes in and they're trying to present something incredibly important to you, and you're scattered because you're trying to keep up. Pause, and you talked about that respect thing. It goes both ways. Be deliberate. If you do have the time and things that you think are urgent aren't so urgent, pause and concentrate on the interaction.
No, that's
because we get
absolutely. And like warrant officers, we don't have, and this is, and when I speak with NCOs and senior NCOs and PME courses and warrant officer courses, I say we don't have the burden of command, right? And we need to have an understanding of that. We are the practical application of command intent, and so have an understanding also, and have the emotional intelligence and the social mastery to realise that if your boss is flat out, like, maybe best coming back later, but more importantly, if it is something urgent, that you reinforce to them respectfully that you need their time now. And that's where I think the closed door thing worked for me. If I came in,
it's a visual cue.
Absolutely, it's a cue,
and I rarely do it, but I will do it if it's necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. And setting up at the start, saying, "Look, sir, ma'am, if I come into your office, I close that door, I really need, and I promise I'll get to the point, but I really need your time." And sometimes it's a bit of a, what's the word I'm looking for? So when you see that your commander or your boss is flustered or is got a lot on their mind, just closing that door and saying, "Hey, boss, like, you good?" and it gives them that circuit breaker. And they go, okay, well, and they'll talk about something. And then at the end, if I notice that, I'll say, hey, how you doing, sir? How you doing, man? You good? Oh, what's going on? Or something which is, that you have, and I always mention this to enlisted leaders is get to know your principal. Get to know what makes them tick, gets to know what they like doing outside of work, get to know what their family makeup's like, get to build that rapport, and then you can inject stuff in there. And when I worked with General Bilton, for example, he loves his AFL. So, if
you two would have gone along really well. Yeah, because you're just talking footy the whole time.
Just loved it. And it was a great circuit breaker, because you imagine the operational environment out at Jock, especially during the middle of a really heavy exercise period like Pack Century or something similar, you'd see that the boss, he was flat out. And sometimes going to a circuit breaker and go, hey, so how did the Lions go last week? That was pretty ordinary. And he was like, oh, yeah, you're right, Ken. And he would start talking about that. And then after a while, you'd realise, okay, he's good. And then walk out, and we're both a little bit more refreshed because I've had that opportunity to have that mental break. So, building that rapport. But equally, I do like your point, sir, is, an officer having that emotional intelligence to go, right, okay, so my senior NCO or my NCO or my senior enlisted leaders walked into the room and said this is important. I need to listen, or at least give them the opportunity to put forward what they have to say. Because
probably at that moment you're doing 10 things poorly because you're juggling, you've got so many plates in the air. Just concentrate on what's important at the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they may have a message from you for you in regards to how you're coming across. The best part, I set up that culture when I was at officer training school, when I was the warrant officer there with my CO, Davin Augustine, and he come into my office and go, are you good? I go, yes, sir, I'm doing fine. Is it coming across and I'm not? He goes, yeah, you look like you're up and about. I go, geez, sorry, thanks for letting me know. Because I was in the zone, I was getting after things. But the CO would come in and go, hey, Roy, you good? Because it looks like you're up and about, and it's getting people a bit antsy. You see a warrant officer running around looking like that, and I go, yeah, I appreciate that, thanks, sir.
Yeah,
no, thanks for letting me know. And it's the same, vice versa. Giving that feedback, they may not know. You just don't know what you don't know. And I think having that ability to be able to just receive that feedback and just take it and then build that rapport with you, it builds rapport immediately.
That's awesome stuff. So if we talk about so sometimes command can be, separated from their elements. I know smaller units have multiple companies out, all over Australia, or it's times you get back to the strategic centre, back to Canberra, and you lose sort of somewhat that touch point with the fighter squadrons, the ships, and the, first line units in army or combat brigades. How refreshing is it to get back into those fighter squadrons, combat brigades, and vice versa? What advice would you give to those senior enlisted members or leaders that are physically dislocated from their call sign? How do they get forward and see and get reinvigorated about the awesome stuff their soldiers, sailors and aviators are doing, and get some good feedback?
Build it into your battle rhythm. It's the only way you can go about it. So my battle rhythm at the moment, sir, is about 1 week in Canberra, 1 to 2 weeks in Canberra, at the most 2 weeks on the road. Whether that's international engagement, whether that's domestic travel and visits. I find if I'm in Canberra for the strategic centre for say longer than 2 weeks in a row, I start to lose that connection with the workforce. I mean, clearly that's my own personal viewpoints, but I'll always have those connections via the network and email and DPN and Teams and Skype and all that kind of stuff. But I think, as we've touched on earlier in the podcast, that getting out from behind your DPN and building it into your battle rhythm, that 1 week a month that you're going to go to these outstations, and that because we have with our geographically displaced chains of command and C2 that we have in the ADF, so I don't think there's too many places, especially a brigade level up across the three services, which don't have elements across the ADF, like building into your battle rhythm. Go out and see them, go out and visit them, and sure, the feedback I get is, well, that's an impost on the travel budget. That's an impost on it. Well, that is the cost of us doing business. Don't get me wrong. There's ways and means of doing that good business in regards to your travel, your TNS, etc. But for the most part, build it into your battle rhythm. About one, depending on the size of your organisation too, at least 1 week a month, you should be getting out and physically walking the ground and going out to those outstations. As an example, I was the Group War Officer at Surveillance and Response Group at RAF Williamtown. There is an SRG element on every Air Force base in Australia. And so my principle is my expectation is that for at least 1 week a month, you are out visiting those outstations, either alongside me or by yourself. And there's a benefit to that too. There's a benefit of being alongside each other because then you're seen as a command and a leadership team, but there's also a benefit of travelling separately because I have the fulsome conversations that I have with – I just can't possibly have a really fulsome conversation workforce when I'm tied to CDF's calendar and schedule, which is planned to the minute. For me, the benefit I can speak on behalf of the boss, go out to for example, go to Fleet Base East and I can spend 2 hours speaking with a group of people, and that's where I get that really good that source of information. But for the most part, developing the trust with the workforce is spending time on the ground with them, and sure, you can do it through online forums, you can do it through Skype, and which works to a particular point. But if you don't walk the ground, you won't develop the trust and the credibility and your presence, because that presence that you have with the workforce, they'll learn to trust that over time that you've built it, that they'll be able to come to you and at least be able to know that you're advocating on their behalf. Equally, sir, when you do travel there, don't instantly dismiss the feedback that has been given to you. So that's wrong. Okay, so as much as you may wish.
You talked about perception.
Yeah.
Yes, it may not be exactly correct,
Absolutely.
But this person is perceiving this to be an issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Don't instantly dismiss it.
Yeah.
And you can question it respectfully. And how I'll put it is if someone says something which I know is just not factually correct or not entirely factual, instead of going, no, you're not. I'll let them finish the question and then say, hey, I've got a counter view. Or I have some information which may be of interest to you to help you maybe think differently in that regard. That communication part too, and so it's just as important. And my advice from the strategic centre, to the outstations across the across our vast land and our vast country, is that make sure you get your language right, make sure you communicate effectively, and don't dismiss people's viewpoints because that's their perception. And sometimes we can, in the strategic centre, we can have a viewpoint that everything that comes out of Canberra, everyone knows about. I have a viewpoint in regards to an email. Like if you send an email, my expectation, I've mentioned this to senior leadership in the past, where if you send an email, you have to expect that maybe at best 25% of the organisation is going to read it. So how do you reinforce that messaging through your networks, through your visits, through your online presence, which
and
is
through your enlisted advisor as well.
Absolutely.
Your job is to go in there and talk about it. Yeah.
Through mediums such as this.
Yeah.
More.
Yeah.
That's why I'm a massive fan of the runway, Cove, these different. I can't, like you mentioned before, so I can't possibly be everywhere at once, but I can spread myself rather thin and really get messaging out through these, because if we sit in Canberra and think that messaging out of the strategic centre is going to reach everyone without actually getting out there and reinforcing it and validating it and making sure it's validated and getting that feedback back into the strategic centre, there's always going to be that disconnect. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I suppose that being ruthless with your calendar, you didn't use the term ruthless, but like being deliberate with your calendar and then not being dismissive, not instantly going to dismissive.
Absolutely.
And that takes time to develop that skill to be like, just let it wash over you.
Yeah.
So it's someone's perception.
Absolutely.
For those, so come back off that component, but to I suppose as the final question to summarise the episode, what advice would you give to sergeant majors, troop sergeants and junior commanders about how to get accurate feedback and then subsequently turn that into advice, or how to go about giving advice?
Okay, well, it goes to my 4 points of probably leadership, sir, is to stay humble, to be relevant, to be engaged and be professional. The humility part we've talked about is that being humbled enough to receive that advice, even though you may not necessarily agree with it. It's their perception, it's their view. Be humble to accept that. Also, be humble to accept feedback of how you operate as as both a leader and a human. Stay relevant. To get the feedback in the first place, staying relevant and contemporary in regards to how you are as a leader. I'm not saying that you need to keep up with the latest fashion trends or something like that. I possibly won't be able to do that, I can assure you. But for the most part, staying relevant and contemporary with regards to the workforce that you're charged with the responsibility of advocating on behalf of. If you can't spend time with them, if you can't immerse yourself with them, well then you'll just lose relevance and credibility with them, and they won't come and give you feedback. I think also, and I touched on it at the start before the podcast started. So a CDF walks into a room, the environment changes immediately, just by virtue of CDF's rank. It's not because he's a bad person or anything other than that. And a 4-star admiral is going to change an environment. Warrant officers and senior enlisted leaders, you should be the environment. You are the environment. You speak on behalf of it. You need to immerse yourself in it. So doing that, once again, goes back to that credibility and building rapport with your workforce to be able to speak trust and truth to you. Engaged. Stay engaged. This is a common theme here, sir, is that this engagement with the workforce and ensuring, whatever medium that is. I think we learned a valuable lesson during COVID, where we thought that Microsoft Teams would get it done, or working from home. And I have particular viewpoints working from home. I think in some points it works, but for the most part, as a military organisation, we need to spend as much time with each other and working alongside each other to build trust and whatnot. And that's very tough to do with working from home, which may be slightly topical with some listeners, but for the most part, there are parts where it can. But for the most part, that engagement piece, there's a little bit lost there where it's just virtual. And last but not least, staying professional. Nothing will get in the way of you being able to receive feedback and then process it and then walk into your commander if you have a lack of professionalism in regards to the engagement either with the commander or with the workforce. Instantly dismissing, being ignorant of someone's viewpoint, being ignorant of someone's position, regardless of rank. They're still a human that deserves respect in regards to what they're talking to you about and if they've come to you, that's been a significant step for them in order to do so. So being humble, relevant, engaged, and professional. I've said it on previous podcasts and in different articles, sir. But I think if you do those, you concentrate on those 4 parts, you'll be able to receive feedback. You'll be able to give advice, taking into consideration all that. And then being able to be advocated accordingly on behalf of your workforce. I think that works. Hopefully that answers you.
Yeah, that does. Yeah. That's awesome. And it weaves through a lot of the themes that we talked about as well, reliability and professionalism and the like, and trying to get, stay relevant. And all of that is really pertinent. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been absolutely awesome. So as we talked about your own journey and going through your career and shifting tack and finding purpose in different places and getting feedback from people that you would not normally get feedback from. You said if you wouldn't get a beer with them, go up and ask, how am I going? Or what is your perception of me? Yep. Subsequently, getting accurate feedback and getting out there amongst the soldiers, sailors and aviators and reinvigorating that. It's incredibly exciting what the combat brigades are doing and what the fighter squadrons and ships are doing. And then subsequently turning that into advice to the most senior member in the ADF. Yeah,
speaking that truth to power, sir, is important, but just as important as speaking truth to people. And that, as I said before, that blind advocacy is not good advocacy. Having a conversation with your workforce, giving a viewpoint, giving answers, giving them reasons to potentially change their viewpoint based on the facts that you may have. But for the most part also is that, in listening to them. I had my last point, sir, I think it'll be a poignant point to finish on. I visited fleet-based West, and so I was at HMAS Stirling, and I'd just spoken with a group of sailors there, and it was a challenging conversation, a challenging discussion, and for the most part there were some negative viewpoints that were put across. A negative atmosphere in regards to not saying that people were negative, just a negative atmosphere. I had this. I think this Kellick this leading seaman had realised that at the end of it, I think I was slightly emotionally drained of it. He comes up and he goes, "Hey, sir, just you listening and us being able to offload some of our frustrations onto you, for the most part, sir, that's all I wanted. And I feel better for it, and I apologise for that. And I walked away from that and I went, sometimes it's just listening and hearing and acknowledging the frustrations they have. They don't necessarily want you to go out and fix it immediately. And for the most part, I think most of them realise that you can't. But going there and listening and saying and advocating and saying that, and the value of my position is that a conversation I might be having with them that day, I might be having later on with CDF, and that tangible connection. Sometimes that's all they want. That you have heard what they've had to say, you've heard their frustrations, and that you take that on board, and that you're going to try and do something about it. They're not always looking for an answer. And I'll be forever grateful to that leading seaman for coming up and telling me that, because it kind of shaped how my engagement with the workforce from now on. So, but thank you so much. It's been a privilege being part of this.
Warrant Officer Ken Robertson, the Senior Enlisted Advisor to the CDF. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks very much, sir. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.